She had lived in the same little yellow house for 47 years, raised her kids there, planted roses out front, and said goodbye to her husband beneath that roof. But one morning, a knock on the door changed everything. The landlord handed her an envelope, and inside, an eviction notice. No warning, no kindness, just 30 days to get out. She thought she had no one left to turn to, until her church found out and did the impossible. Margaret Jones was 78 years old and had been a widow for nearly 2 decades. She lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Savannah, Georgia, in a modest one-story home with chipping paint and a white picket fence that had seen better days. But to her it was everything. This house had history. She and her late husband Harold bought it in 1976 with a Veterans Affairs loan. Back then, it was brand new. They raised 2 children in it, hosted Thanksgiving dinners, repaired the roof themselves after a hurricane, laughed in the kitchen, cried in the hallway, danced in the living room. But after Harold died, Margaret couldn't afford the taxes on her own. She sold the house to a private investor and worked out a rental agreement so she could keep living there. "It's still my home," she told her friends. "I might not own it, but my memories do." That peace lasted for a while, until the landlord changed. The new owner, a property management firm based 2 states away. No letters, no phone calls, no introductions. Just a notice slid under the door one rainy morning. Notice to vacate. This property will be undergoing redevelopment. All tenants must vacate within 30 days. Margaret stared at the paper in her hands. Her knees buckled. She sank to the kitchen chair, heart pounding. Redevelopment. She hadn't missed a payment. She wasn't behind on rent. But the paper didn't care. It was legal, final. She had a month to leave the home she had lived in for nearly half a century. That afternoon, she called the number at the bottom of the notice. Voicemail. She called again. Same thing. No explanation, no empathy, just silence. By the end of the day, she was sitting on the couch with her head in her hands, surrounded by boxes she hadn't even asked for. That night she didn't sleep. She just stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Lord, what am I supposed to do now?" The next day, Margaret did what she always did. When she didn't have answers, she went to church. Her church, St. Andrew's Community Chapel, was more than a building. It was family. She had been a member there since 1982. She taught Sunday school, led women's prayer groups, baked for every potluck, sat in the same pews every week, 3rd row from the front. That Sunday she walked in with red eyes and trembling hands, and her pastor, Reverend Holt, knew something was wrong the moment he saw her. He approached gently. "Margaret." She handed him the notice. His face fell. After the service, he gathered a small group, deacons, choir members, and close friends. They sat around a folding table in the fellowship hall. The eviction notice laid out between them. "She's been here longer than I have," said Deacon Samuel. "She's like the foundation of this church. She's got nowhere to go," whispered Sister Pauline. "We can't let this happen." But the numbers didn't lie. Margaret lived on a fixed income. There was no way she could afford the rising rent in town, much less a move. And buying back the house, out of the question, or so they thought. What happened next began with a single voice. "I know this sounds crazy," Reverend Holt said, "but what if we raised the money? What if we bought the house ourselves?" The room went silent. "Buy the house," someone repeated. For Margaret, a pause. Then Sister Pauline smiled. "God doesn't work with easy math. He works with impossible faith." The church meeting didn't end that Sunday. In fact, it turned into the beginning of something far bigger than anyone expected. By Tuesday, the small committee of 7, Pastor Holt, Deacon Samuel, Sister Pauline, the youth director, and 3 longtime members, had come together again in the back room of St. Andrew's with notepads, calculators, and a whole lot of prayer. "Let's be real," said the youth director, Carla. "Buying a house, even a small one like Margaret's, That's not something you do with a bake sale. We're not buying a building, Pastor Holt replied. We're saving a legacy. The numbers were daunting. According to local records, the property had appreciated in value over the years. Developers were eyeing it to bulldoze and replace with modern duplexes. The estimated market price, $135,000. The church had up $3,421 in its emergency fund, and a bake sale wouldn't cut it. But they didn't back down. Instead, they made a plan. Step 1, start a fundraiser. Step 2, get the word out. Step 3, pray like crazy. By the end of the week, they launched the campaign online under the title, Help, Keep Grandma Margaret in Her Home. They included photos of Margaret standing on her porch, waving with her gentle smile and white curls tucked under a sun hat. They told her story, how she had spent 47 years in that house, lost her husband, served the community, and was now being forced out with nowhere to go. The post was honest, emotional, real. They set the goal at $150,000 just in case the seller pushed for more. Most people thought they were crazy. But that Sunday, Pastor Holt stood in front of the congregation with a quiet fire in his voice. We don't need a miracle, he said. We just need people. People who care. People who see a grandmother being pushed out and decide that enough is enough. The church gave what they could. Widows donated from their Social Security checks. Teens emptied savings jars. One young boy from the children's ministry handed over his piggy bank with a note that said, Miss Margaret gave me cookies. I want her to have her house. Within the first 48 hours, they raised $400 to $800, more than the church had expected, but a long way from the goal. Then something unexpected happened. Carla, the youth director, had posted the campaign link on Facebook with the caption, My church is trying to save a widow's home. Even $5 helps. Please share. She didn't think much of it, but someone else did. Her old college roommate, now living in Atlanta, shared it with her office team. Then someone else shared it on Reddit. And then a popular Christian podcast picked up the story during a weekend segment. Within 72 hours, the total jumped to $25,000, then $42,000. Then one morning, Margaret woke up to Pastor Holt at her door, holding a laptop, tears in his eyes. Margaret, it's happening. She looked down. $512. Margaret sat down slowly on the porch steps. I don't understand, she whispered. You don't have to, he said. Just receive it. And yet, even as hope grew, time ran out. The 30-day deadline came and went. A man in a suit appeared at her door with a clipboard. I'm sorry, ma'am. Unless this property is bought outright by the end of the week, we're going to have to move forward with demolition. A construction crew is already scheduled. Margaret just nodded, handed him a cookie and said, God bless you anyway. That night, the total hit $113,000. Close, but not enough. And the church had nothing left to give. It seemed like hope might collapse in the final hours, until a stranger showed up at St. Andrew's the next morning. A woman in her 30s, wore jeans, drove in from out of state. She walked up to the pulpit after morning prayer and quietly said, I read about Margaret online. I lost my grandma last year. She raised me. And I can't stand the thought of someone else losing theirs like this. So, I want to help finish this. She wrote a check for $40,000 on the spot. The church fell silent. No one spoke until Margaret, who had been sitting quietly near the back, walked forward with trembling hands and said, Can I hug you? The young woman smiled through tears. I was hoping you would. The entire church thought it was over. The goal had been met, more than met in fact. The final total came in at $153,742. Thanks to that one final act of kindness from a woman who had never even met Margaret, but felt her story deep in her bones. The next morning, Pastor Holt contacted the property management company to arrange the purchase. He had never sounded prouder. We're ready to buy. We'll pay the full amount in cash as requested. Let's draw up the contract." But the man on the phone paused, then said something that made Pastor Holt's smile vanish. "Actually, there's been a new offer on the property, much higher, from a development group. Unless your church can beat that price, I'm afraid the house is no longer available." Pastor Holt stood in silence, the phone pressed to his ear. "You already agreed to give us a chance to buy it." "Yes," the man said, "but we hadn't signed anything, and this new offer is nearly double, $300,000. A pause. "This is just business, Pastor." Back at the church, the celebration halted. Everyone sat in stunned silence as Pastor Holt shared the news. "They moved the finish line," he said. "After we crossed it." Sister Pauline gripped the back of a pew and whispered, "How can they do that?" "They're not doing it to us," said Deacon Samuel bitterly. "They're doing it for money." Margaret sat quietly in the front row, holding the rose-embroidered Bible Harold had given her 30 years ago. She looked up and said softly, "It's okay." Everyone turned. "What do you mean?" Carla asked. "This was for you." "I'm 78 years old," Margaret said. "I've had a good life, a full life. If God meant for me to stay, He would have made it possible. But maybe someone else needs that blessing now." The room went still, but Pastor Holt wasn't ready to give up. The next morning he made a call to the local newspaper, then to the news station, then to a pastor friend across town who ran a larger church with a media team. If the developers wanted to play hardball, he would bring the whole town to the table. By that evening, the story had gone viral again. Elderly widow raises funds to save her home. Now, being outbid by developers, people were furious. Donations started coming in again, even though the campaign was technically over. One woman in Chicago messaged the church directly, "I can't believe this. I lost my home last year, and nobody helped me. But this church, they did everything right. Count me in for another $500. A construction worker sent a video to the church's Facebook page. "If they try to bulldoze that house, they'll have to go through me first. I'll stand in the driveway." By midweek, the developer's inbox was flooded with emails, calls, complaints, even a petition with 50,000 signatures. Suddenly, the house wasn't just a home. It was a symbol, and the developer the villain. Then something truly unexpected happened. A local attorney showed up at St. Andrews. Her name was Elise Tran. "I've been following the story," she said. "I specialize in housing law, and I just reviewed the original agreement from years ago between Margaret and the first landlord." She laid out a printed copy. "There's a clause, a right of first refusal. It means that before the owner can sell to anyone else, they have to give Margaret or her representatives the first chance to match the price." The room lit up. Pastor Holt blinked. "You're saying we can fight this?" Elise nodded. "I'm saying you already won. They just didn't expect you to know it." That night, Pastor Holt made one more call to the property firm. When they answered, he didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just read them the clause. Slowly, clearly, and with the entire church board listening on speakerphone. There was a long pause, then a sigh. "We'll prepare the papers." When the phone call ended, the church erupted. Tears, cheers, applause that shook the old wooden pews. Margaret sat there stunned as Pastor Holt leaned over and gently took her hand. "You're going home, Margaret." She blinked slowly, like she couldn't quite believe it. "But I never left." The final paperwork moved quickly. Elise, the attorney who had volunteered her time, worked day and night to ensure the purchase was airtight. She reviewed every line, crossed every T's, dotted every I. By Friday, the title was transferred. The little yellow house, the one Margaret had shared with Harold, the one where her children had taken their first steps, the one with roses blooming out front, was now hers, officially, legally, and forever. But the church wasn't done. They had one more surprise. On Saturday morning, they gathered in front of the house. It wasn't just church members anymore. The entire town had shown up. Dozens of people. Some who knew Margaret, others who had only heard about her story online or in the evening news. They lined the sidewalk. They brought balloons. They brought folding chairs and casseroles and welcome home signs. Sister Pauline had baked a 3-layer cake that read, "Welcome home, Miss Margaret," and taped below it, in small frosting letters, Psalm 126:3. "The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy." When Margaret arrived riding in the front seat of Carla's SUV, the crowd stood and clapped. Pastor Holt stepped up to her door and opened it like she was royalty. Margaret stepped out in a pale blue dress and her Sunday shoes, her white curls pinned back, her smile soft but stunned. Someone handed her a small wooden box. Inside was the key, a brand new one, polished, attached to a silver chain. Her hands trembled as she held it up. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say a thing," Pastor Holt said. "You've said enough for 40 years by living with grace." Margaret walked slowly up the steps of her porch. She paused to run her hand along the railing. Same creaky wood, same chipped paint. Then she reached the door, slid the key in, turned it, and stepped inside. The living room had been cleaned and polished by volunteers the night before. The couch cushions fluffed, the old curtains washed and hung. A fresh bouquet of sunflowers sat on the table. The house smelled like lemon polish and hope. Margaret walked through it room by room, touching every surface like someone greeting a long-lost friend. In the hallway, she paused in front of a framed photo of Harold in his army uniform. She reached up, touched the frame. "We made it, Harold," she whispered. "We're home." Outside, someone had brought a speaker, and without warning, soft gospel music began to play. People started singing old hymns, joyful songs, laughter mixed with harmony. Kids played on the sidewalk. Teenagers handed out lemonade. Even the local mayor stopped by and gave Margaret a small certificate declaring July 12th Margaret Jones Day in the town of Hartsville. It was more than a celebration. It was a resurrection. And yet, even with the victory, Margaret's heart stayed humble. "This isn't just about me," she told the news crew that showed up that afternoon. "It's about what people can do when they stop waiting for someone else to fix things." She paused. "It's about love that shows up." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the crowd began to thin, Margaret sat on her porch swing. She looked at the house, then at the people folding chairs and gathering leftovers. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like a burden. She felt like a blessing. A week after Margaret stepped back through her front door, things began to change, not just for her, but for the entire town. It started with a letter, a handwritten note, slipped under the door of St. Andrew's Community Chapel. No name, no return address. Inside was a short message. "My mother was also evicted while battling cancer. I wish I'd been able to do something then. Thank you for doing what I couldn't." Folded with the letter was a check for $10,000 made out to the church's newly created Benevolence Housing Fund. Pastor Holt stared at it for nearly a full minute before speaking. "God's not done with this story." Word spread quickly. The church had done the impossible for one woman. And now, people wanted to know, could they do it again? Requests began to pour in. A disabled veteran facing foreclosure, a single mom about to lose her rental, an elderly couple with no heat and a leaking roof. They all came to the church, not for miracles, but for hope. And St. Andrew's answered. The church board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to create a new initiative, the Margaret Project. Its mission was simple. No one in our town loses their home without a fight. They didn't promise to save everyone, but they promised to try. Volunteers signed up in droves. Electricians offered free repairs. A local real estate agent donated a portion of every sale to the fund. Teenagers from the youth group went door to door collecting donations, and every Sunday Pastor Holt would close the service with the same lines: "If we have a roof, let's be grateful. If we can give someone a roof, let's be obedient." As for Margaret, she became something of a local legend. People brought her casseroles, stopped her in the street for hugs, and even asked her to speak at a town hall meeting. Her reply: "I'm just a grandma with a garden and a lot of prayers. But if my story helps somebody else keep their keys, then praise the Lord." One afternoon, Margaret was invited to speak at the local high school. The auditorium filled with teens, some slouched in their chairs, others scrolling on their phones. But when Margaret took the stage, wearing her Sunday dress and holding that same rose-embroidered Bible, everything went still. "I thought my life was ending when I got that eviction notice," she said softly. "Turns out, it was just beginning." She spoke about grief, about courage, about the power of community. And when she finished, something incredible happened. A senior in the back row stood up and asked, "Can we start a food pantry here for students who go home hungry?" Applause broke out. The principal nodded through tears. And just like that, the ripple grew wider. A few weeks later, a reporter from a national news station came to Hartsville. She sat down with Margaret on her porch. "You've inspired people across the country," the reporter said. "How does it feel?" Margaret chuckled, brushing a leaf from her lap. "It feels like I'm still just Margaret. I hang my laundry on a line, and I put sugar in my cornbread." "But you are a hero," the reporter said. Margaret looked off toward her rose bushes and replied, "No, sweetheart. The heroes are the people who showed up." That evening, as twilight settled over Hartsville, Margaret sat on her porch with her Bible in one hand and a cup of chamomile tea in the other. Across the street, kids rode bikes. A neighbor waved. The wind blew softly through the trees, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt not just safe, but seen. It had been nearly 2 months since Margaret's home was saved. Since then, her quiet little story had traveled far beyond the sidewalks of Hartsville. News outlets across the country had picked it up. She was mentioned on morning shows, radio segments, and blogs. But Margaret hadn't let it change her. She still baked banana bread every Thursday, still wore her gardening gloves too high on her wrists, still called everyone under the age of 40 sweetheart. Then came the letter, official, embossed, from Washington, D.C. Carla, the youth director, found Margaret in her rose garden and handed her the envelope. "You might want to sit down." Before opening this, Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Unless this is from the IRS, I can take it standing up." She opened the envelope slowly, then gasped, "Dear Mrs. Jones, you are cordially invited to speak at the National Faith and Service Conference on Capitol Hill. Your story has moved hearts across the country. We would be honored to have you share your experience with lawmakers, advocates, and community leaders." A few weeks later, Margaret stepped onto a plane. For the first time in 30 years, she held her purse tightly in her lap. The whole way, her expression a mix of awe and anxiety. "Don't worry," said the young woman in the seat next to her. "Flying's easy." Margaret smiled. "Honey, I raised 2 kids, lived through a war, and beat an eviction notice. This is nothing." Washington was overwhelming at first. Bustling streets, tall buildings, noise, and security lines, longer than church potlucks. But when Margaret entered the grand hall, where the conference was held, she felt something familiar. People from everywhere, listening, just like they had in her little church fellowship room. When it was time for her speech, Margaret stood behind a podium made of polished oak. She looked out at the crowd, elected officials, policy advocates, mayors, reporters. She adjusted the microphone, took a breath, and began. "I never asked for any of this," she said. "I just wanted to stay in my house, the one where I raised babies and buried my husband. I thought my story ended with a letter taped to my door, but it didn't." She talked about her church, about her town, about the people who gave, even when they had little, because they believed no one should lose their home in silence. When she finished, the room stood, not out of politeness, but conviction. After the speech, she was ushered into a private roundtable meeting with lawmakers. One congresswoman leaned forward and said, "You just told the story of 1,000 people in my district." Another added, "We talk a lot about policy, but we forget the faces behind it. Thank you for putting a face on what eviction really means." Margaret simply replied, "I'm not a politician. I'm a praying woman. I just speak what I know." Later that night, as she walked past the Lincoln Memorial, she whispered to no one in particular, "I don't know what you're doing with me, Lord, but I'm still following." Back in Hartsville, the church gathered around a TV in the fellowship hall to watch the broadcast replay of her speech. People cried, applauded, and when Margaret returned home, they met her at the airport with handmade signs, "Our hero." She spoke for all of us. "Welcome home, Margaret." Margaret, still stunned, turned to Pastor Holt and said, "I don't know why God picked me." He smiled, "Because he knew you'd use the microphone to lift everyone else up." That evening, as she unpacked her suitcase, Margaret placed one new item on the shelf, beside her Bible and Harold's photo, a plaque that read, "For service, courage, and unshakable faith." And next to it, a sticky note in her own handwriting. "This home was never just mine. It belongs to every soul who believed in something bigger than the notice on the door." The return from Washington was everything Margaret hoped for, quiet, familiar, and full of gratitude. But peace doesn't always last forever, and sometimes even the strongest hearts are tested. It began with a cough, just a tickle at first, nothing Margaret hadn't brushed off before. But after a few weeks, it didn't go away. Her energy dipped, her appetite faded. Carla noticed it, first bringing groceries one afternoon. "You look a little tired, Miss Margaret." "I'm just slowing down," baby Margaret replied with a smile. 78 isn't a sprint anymore. But something in her voice didn't sit right. At church that Sunday, Margaret didn't sing. She held her hymnal lips, still hands trembling slightly. Pastor Holt made eye contact from the pulpit, his expression tight with concern. That afternoon, he drove to her house himself. They sat on the porch sipping sweet tea. "Have you seen a doctor?" he asked gently. "I did," she admitted. "And?" Margaret hesitated, then reached into the side table drawer and pulled out a folded paper. A diagnosis: stage 2 lung cancer. The news hit the church like a thunderclap. The woman who had inspired a nation, who had stared down eviction and stood before Congress, was now facing something even harder, her own body turning against her. But just like before, she wouldn't face it alone. The very next day, volunteers showed up on her lawn. They trimmed her rose bushes, scrubbed the porch, cleaned out the gutters. Meals started arriving every evening, enough to feed an army. One of the teens from the youth group, Jamie, mowed her lawn every Saturday without being asked. Margaret began treatment quietly. She didn't want cameras, didn't want attention. She just wanted time. Time to pray. Time to write letters to her grandkids. Time to sit under her favorite oak tree and feel the breeze. But something beautiful happened in those quiet days. Her story started spreading again, not because of what she was going through, but how she was going through it. The local paper ran a new headline: "Hartsville's strongest voice still has more to say." She was asked to write a guest column. She titled it, "Hope Isn't Just for the Healed." In it she wrote, "I may be sick, but I am not finished. The body may slow, but the soul still sings. And as long as I have breath, I'll spend it reminding people that love still wins." Her church created a hope wall. In the fellowship hall, notes of encouragement, scriptures, quotes from Margaret's speeches. Children drew pictures. Veterans sent thank you cards. One woman dropped off a prayer blanket stitched with the words, "You held the line. Now we've got you." Margaret smiled when she saw it. "You know," she said one day to Carla, "I spent my life thinking the home was the story. But it wasn't. It was the people." Carla wiped her eyes. "You built something, Miss Margaret. Something bigger than any house. Margaret nodded and whispered, "Then I'm ready for whatever comes next." But what came next surprised even her. One evening, Pastor Holt stood up after service with an announcement. He tapped the microphone and cleared his throat. "We all know Margaret never asked for anything, but we want to give her something anyway." He pointed toward the side doors. They opened slowly, and through them walked Margaret's son, daughter-in-law, and 3 grandkids flown in from 3 different states, coordinated in secret by the church. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth. Tears filled her eyes as she stood to greet them. The youngest ran straight into her arms. "You came," she whispered, holding them tightly. "We wouldn't be anywhere else," her son replied. The moment wasn't grand. It wasn't televised, but it was everything. Love, presence, family. That night, Margaret sat in her armchair, grandkids asleep on the couch, the hum of the kitchen sink in the background. She looked out the window, where the porch light glowed softly on the lawn. "Lord," she whispered, "if this is what you meant by the impossible, I see it now." Spring came early that year in Hartsville. The roses in Margaret's front yard bloomed faster than usual, full, vibrant, reaching for the sun. Neighbors said it was the warmest March they could remember. But inside the little yellow house, on the corner of Rosewood Lane, time had begun to slow. Margaret's health had declined quietly and gracefully. She insisted on staying home, her home, surrounded by photos, flowers, and the church family that had carried her more than once. Hospice nurses came during the day. Carla came at night and sat with her, reading scriptures, singing old hymns. And every Sunday, Pastor Holt brought communion to her bedside, his voice thick with emotion each time he prayed over her. But Margaret never complained. She never asked why, only smiled and said, "I've been given more than most. I'm just finishing the chapter." One morning before the sun fully rose, Margaret took her final breath. Peaceful, no pain, just the sound of birds outside her window, and the soft whisper of her name from a voice none of us could hear. Her hand was resting on her Bible, and beside her, the key to the house, the one the church had fought for, the one she had always called home. Word of her passing spread quickly. Within hours, the front porch filled with candles, flowers, and handwritten notes. "Thank you for teaching us how to love. Your legacy will bloom like your roses. You never gave up, so we won't either." At the funeral, the entire town came. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the church sanctuary. The mayor, veterans, teenagers, single moms, business owners, widows, all of them had been touched by her story. All of them carried part of her strength. Pastor Holton spoke from the pulpit. "I've been a pastor for 26 years. I've preached over 1,000 funerals. But today, I don't say goodbye to just a member. I say goodbye to the heart of this church." He paused, wiping his eyes. Margaret didn't just teach us how to stand. She taught us how to stay faithful, stay hopeful, stay rooted. Like those rose bushes out front. He motioned to a small table beside the pulpit. On it sat Margaret's Bible, her framed photo with Harold, and the house key. After the service, something remarkable happened. Carla stepped forward with a letter, written by Margaret, weeks before her passing. She had asked that it be read only after she was gone. Carla unfolded it and began, "To my church, my town, my family, thank you for loving me when I had nothing left to give, for showing me that home isn't just 4 walls, it's people, it's prayer, it's presence. I want you to know something. This house, it doesn't end with me. I've left instructions for it to become what you all helped it be: a refuge, a blessing, a home. Let this house be a place for the next person who needs hope. Let them walk through the door and feel what I felt: belonging. Love, always, Margaret." Gasps echoed across the sanctuary. She had left the house to the church to be used as a transitional home for women and seniors facing housing insecurity. She had turned her miracle into a mission. That summer, the little yellow house reopened. The sign out front read, "The Margaret House, a place to stay, a place to stand." And the first woman to move in, a widow named Gloria, recently displaced after her apartment complex was sold. She stepped into the living room with tears in her eyes. "I don't know who she was," she whispered, "but I can feel her here." In the years that followed, dozens more would come through those doors. Some stayed weeks, others stayed months, each left stronger than when they arrived. Each one carried a piece of Margaret with them when they left. And every spring, just as the roses bloomed along the fence, someone would hang a fresh sign on the porch rail. Still here, still home, still hers. Margaret Jones may have left this world, but her story lives on. In every hug, every roof, raised every heart that chooses faith when the facts say, give up. Because love doesn't stop when the last page turns. It plants seeds and waits for them to bloom. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of hope, heart, and healing. And join us next time, because sometimes the smallest voices make the loudest miracles.